Hello, welcome to my channel, Save Infinity. So in this video, I just wanted to, kind of talk again more about those sort of ideas of the different layers of reality, if you will, kind of from that sort of, everything, everywhere, all at once sort of idea of different sort of, wavelengths of reality surrounding us in that sort of quantum infinite field that we can, tap into and align to. Like that this sort of layer of reality that we're experiencing isn't the only one. It's just kind of like one little track, one little train track in an infinite realm of spaghetti of train tracks. And then we sort of, align to the train track that our sort of, energy and consciousness level and state and what have you kind of, aligns us to. Our beliefs and programming, our fears or, worries or what have you, and just, our general sort of energetic state of, of stress or calm or things like that, or, morals and values, and just, the sort of expanded awareness of our consciousness as well, and what it's, able to sort of, expand to and to receive and to adjust to, all those sort of different little parameters going on in our sort of mind, body, soul aspects can then kind of, formulate and align us to what sort of track on reality we're kind of, chugging down. It's like when you hear those stories of people, particularly in more ancient times or what have you, kind of literally being able to, shift realities in that way of suddenly just, shifting to a whole different, layer of reality by, shifting their energy and consciousness in that way. Or, they talk about certain ideas of, certain aspects of, say, like the pyramids in ancient Egypt, and certain, secret chambers, or certain aspects of, the pyramids with, ancient secret knowledge not even being accessible by, say, like general people, because it was like created in, say, just a different track of reality. And most general people are kind of aligning to this track over here where they just see the general normal pyramids, but then some people with the right energetic signature, if you will, is kind of like a little key that unlocks a door for them to go into this track of reality and have a whole different experience of what the pyramids appear to be. And so it's like, there's all these potentials and possibilities for different, layers and tracks of reality around us that can be, unlocked by that key of our own energetic signature, which is an exciting and cool and wonderful thing to think about, even from aspects, certain, channelings from certain beings or what have you that have, been posted online and such. Discussing even, the idea of different layers of this earth reality as well, where, there could be a layer of reality going on right now that's a lot more doom and gloom, but also a layer of reality going on where it's, very peaceful paradise. And so, all those exist, like concurrently existing all at one time, that sort of everything everywhere all at once aspect, different fractals of the one, the one sort of earth reality potentials, and we're just, tuned into one fractal of that experience. But there are all these different sort of, fractals and tracks of reality that we can tune to and align to, which is exciting and cool to think about, with all those sort of, potentials and possibilities, and just sort of, how wondrous and infinite reality truly is in that aspect. Kind of like those stories as well you hear of, the kind of vibe of, say one explorer might, go to an area and they just see like a barren wasteland desert, and then another explorer might go to that same area and they might, find this whole like, like temple village paradise, and, living in a little mini garden of Eden. And it's because, their energetic signature kind of, unlocked you know, was a key to unlock the door to a different pathway of reality, like a different fractal, you know, of that infinite sort of, you know, fractal faced reality, you know, kind of like when you have a crystal or something like that that has, you know, all the different little fractals and edges on it. It's kind of like, you know, you could think of reality like that, with all these different, you know, faces and possibilities, and then the part that we kind of tune to and tunes to us depends on our own sort of, you know, energetic state as well, and they kind of, you know, tune and align together with that sort of co-creative experience. Really, you know, gives so much of more weight to the whole idea of, you know, endless infinite sort of possibilities for, you know, future potentials of the reality we do experience, particularly now as we kind of, you know, are advancing and evolving more, you know, consciously as well, you know, expanding our conscious state, but also just technologically and things like that as well. You know, being able to advance more in those ways really kind of opens up and expands our mind to be able to really perceive all those sort of greater possibilities and potentials. Whereas, say, if we're living more in a, you know, simple, if you want to call it like that, sort of lifestyle, you know, just with very sort of basic tools and technology, kind of perceiving real, you know, out there, you know, sort of different infinite realities can be a bit harder to really kind of imagine or perceive or comprehend. You know, but when we kind of break out into this, you know, whole idea of, you know, we've got like AI now and all sorts of, you know, more, you know, advanced technology really kind of, you know, allows us to more easily imagine and perceive just like all sorts of, you know, wild and amazing potentials for reality. And then, you know, if you're able to imagine it in that way, and, you know, if you're able to you know, see it, you know, visually in your third eye, if you will, and able to, you know, to feel it within you and able to believe it, you know, then you're really able to align to it, as well as it technically does exist. As you know, it's an infinite universe. Technically everything does exist everywhere all at once. So if you're able to, you know, imagine it and perceive it and see it and feel it and believe it, then you're able to absolutely align to it in some aspect as well. You know, and the greater we get at being able to do that as well, the more we'll really just propel forward into a whole new sort of, you know, world where we're really able to, you know, perceive and imagine and create all these new sort of, you know, wondrous things and aspects and experiences of reality that we'll be able to really align to and bring in and manifest into our, you know, our lived reality. It'll be like, you know, a big new boom chapter of the way of, you know, that humanity is able to experience reality on this planet. You know, particularly with ideas of how you hear of, you know, how other sort of star beings or, you know, alien races or whatever you want to, however you want to call it, even, you know, stories from, you know, ancient beings on this planet or what have you, just, you know, but all those sort of stories and stuff that you can hear about different ways of life being lived and different experiences and different, you know, capabilities spiritually and technologically. You know, all those sort of experiences are something that we can, you know, eventually bring in for ourselves too. It really does open up a range of amazing, you know, wondrous possibilities, you know, kind of in those aspects of, you know, Jesus and all his, you know, capabilities and miracles, and, you know, being able to walk on water and, you know, turn water into wine and all the amazing wondrous things he was doing, because he kind of, you know, understood that infinite sort of potential and existence of reality, and how we are all, you know, all kind of one energy connected and flowing through that all. And so, you know, kind of like in a Matrix movie kind of way, he was able to, you know, influence and co-create with reality in those sort of wondrous ways. And although it might seem, you know, a little new or peculiar for our sort of, you know, current, you know, human selves, if you will, we're all still, you know, infinite and eternal souls. So it's likely we've all kind of lived these sort of, you know, more advanced wild experiences, either, you know, even on this planet or on other planets, or what have you. But it's all sort of, you know, locked away and encoded in there somewhere, that we are able to remember and unlock it in that way as well. You know how they would talk about, you know, people, you know, certain ascended masters or what have you, you know, back in the day, or even other, you know, star beings that visited this planet or what have you, being able to, you know, like levitate objects and, you know, shapeshift objects or shapeshift themselves, and, you know, all sorts of, you know, amazing things in that aspect, that we really do have the potential and capacity to unlock within our own reality and like within ourselves. We really do have all that sort of infinite potential within ourselves, and we are, you know, kind of projecting all that infiniteness, you know, and infinite energy out into the reality we experience and perceive. But, you know, there's so much infinite potential of the way that can be, you know, projected and reflected and experienced. You know, just because we're on one track of reality currently doesn't mean we can't, you know, jump to another track of reality, or experience another fractal of that infinite, you know, holographic type reality experience. And, you know, the whole as within so without, as above so below, like, you know, all of that sort of infinite potential is, you know, within us, in an aspect within our own infinite eternal soul. You know, even for myself as well, you know, I've regularly had dreams, you know, where I've been able to fly or levitate or what have you. And I know I'm not, you know, the only person. People talk about those things all the time. And, you know, and it can feel so, you know, just real and normal in a dream. And that sort of, you know, feeling and knowing can become just as real and normal in, you know, waking reality as well. You know, it's all still us. You know, that illusion of separation in that way is just that, you know, it's all just different layers of one reality, and all different, you know, perspectives and manifestations of one source energy. And I've also had, you know, like moments of like remembering and visioning and or what have you, that I've, you know, mentioned before in older videos, but of like how I felt like at some point in time I was able to just, you know, travel to other planets and star systems, you know, not even needing like a ship or anything like that, just kind of looking out, you know, at where you want to go, zooming in on the star, or then zooming in on the planet, and then you just zoom in enough that it's kind of, you know, essentially right there, and you just sort of step on over to it, and then everything just zooms back out to its normal perspectives. And so, you know, it wouldn't surprise me as well, you know, if in the future, rather than just, you know, how we currently go on holidays overseas to other countries, instead it's like we go, you know, on holidays interplanetary to, you know, other systems and other planets. And that'll be the new, you know, the new normal form of, you know, going on a holiday, or, you know, traveling around. You know, especially once we do kind of, you know, reach a more peaceful, you know, harmony sort of aspect globally on Earth, on our planet, then that, you know, kind of as within so without sort of, you know, way really reflects into the universe as well. Whereas if we're kind of, you know, existing on a planet that's full of conflict in many areas, then that can kind of, you know, reflect out to the universe, that if we tried to visit certain places out there, they might be full of conflict or conflict towards us as well. Whereas, you know, if we have a more harmony and peaceful state globally, then that's more likely to reflect out to the universe, you know, in the fractal of the universe that we're experiencing in that aspect. That'll be, you know, a more peaceful, you know, fractal of the infinite universe that we're able to visit. You know, and also with that, the idea as well with the soul, everything everywhere all at once, you know, with these different sort of layers of reality. It's like there's already, you know, beings or consciousness or what have you already experiencing and living in those realities and existing in those ways as their form of normal. And so, it's not necessarily about having to create such a reality or such a future, but aligning to it, because everything already does exist. It's just, taking those steps and measures to align to such, realities. As they kind of say, it's kind of, all energy and frequency, like different wavelengths. And it's kind of just like tuning your radio to that radio station, right? All the different radio channels already exist, playing those different songs and different music. So just because you're on one channel listening to one song doesn't mean that's the only song that's, in existence, or that is, able to be played. You can, tune your radio and change the channel and pick up different, wavelengths and different, stations and different music. And so, kind of a similar way of we can, tune and change the channel of our own radio in that energetic sense to align to the different, wavelengths and frequencies of those different realities. And in that aspect as well, everything kind of existing in an infinite, quantum holographic field, and kind of, everywhere all at once in that sort of way. And, the idea of, Akashic records and things like that, really gives so much way to the possibilities and ways that life and reality can truly be experienced. And with kind of, life being more, like a dream or a matrix reality like that, if you will. And, like Jesus's abilities of, turning water into wine, like, even in the future, it's like you could do things, like, for example, I guess, people that still want to, eat or enjoy meat or what have you, but without having to actually harm any animals, because, the whatever you want to call it, like the coding or the makeup for meat is already kind of, like saved in the Akashic records, if you will, or is already like, within our internal experience. We already know like what that is. And I guess similar to kind of like how we have like 3D printing, kind of like 3D printing meat, but you can literally just kind of, the atoms and molecules in the air, what have you, just kind of recoding them into the code of meat, just kind of manifesting, kind of like turning that water into wine. You can just turn the air or the empty space, the empty infinite space that surrounds us into that form of meat without actually having to, harm an animal. And, with those sort of same aspects as well, say in the future, you could have restaurants and stuff around that don't even need like waiters or anything like that working there to, free up that sort of ability to just live and exist and create. Instead, people could just focus on creating a menu and, creating the meals and what have you. And then those meals are kind of, logged in that sort of, Akashic records in a sense, or just kind of, logged in the save files, if you will, like more like a game mentality. And then you can just, go to the restaurant, see the menu, and then just choose what you want, and then it can just, be loaded and manifested onto your plate. Because everything already does exist in that aspect. It's just about what we're able to, remember and perceive and imagine. And so once we've already created it, it's really like it already was created. We were just remembering it in a sense. But once we've done that, created it or remembered it, then it's, it is there, kind of in our logs, in our save files, and it can just be re-manifested in that way of, the coding of reality and the atoms and molecules or what have you, whatever you want to look at it, kind of like how in a video game, right, those pixels are just rendered to certain things, and some of them are rendered as a table, and some of the pixels become, a wall for a house or the sky. Our reality works in much of a similar way, where it's at, source energy consciousness manifesting out of that sort of infinite fractal potential possibility into what it's appearing as the grass, as a table, as a plate. And just as, Jesus was able to walk on the water or turn water into wine, you are able to kind of, recode or reprogram those whatever you want to call them, like atoms, molecules, particles, or, you know, just empty void space. But you can, you know, recode or remanifest what that's going to be. And once you have those certain ideas, say a certain dish at a restaurant, kind of saved in those save files, it's not like you need to recreate it from scratch every time. You can just, you know, remanifest those particles or molecules into that. And so, you know, being able to unlock such capabilities of, you know, and potentials on a wide, you know, scale for, you know, the whole of humanity really, you know, changes and opens up the sort of aspects and ways that we can experience our reality, really gives us more freedom to explore and to create in that sort of way, rather than just focusing on survival in a way that we generally don't really need to in many aspects, once we kind of learn and understand more those really sort of fundamental aspects of what reality truly is, from that sort of, you know, quantum holographic infinite sense. Once we really kind of, you know, integrate and you know, understand that from such a level, there's just so much infinite potential of a way we can embody and experience and utilize that to form and create the reality we experience and live in, which is, you know, super exciting and wondrous and magical for all that sort of, you know, potential that we do have within us, and that we can, you know, create and explore in that sort of, you know, infinite universe sort of sense. All right, well, might leave this one here for now. You know, could go on forever, for infinity, talking about such a thing. But, you know, leave some of those little nuggets and seeds there for now, for you to gently water them, and, you know, and we'll see what grows and what seeds we plant next. All right, I'm wishing you all the best on your journey, and sending you so much peace, love, light, and blessings as always. Bye.